The Telepathy Tapes on Facilitated Communication Double-Blind Test, exploring facilitator cueing in a touch-based form of FC. Welcome to another critique of facilitated communication.
Why is it that most of the time, most of the autistic individuals are not looking at the keyboard?
Just a heads up to my regular viewers. First, thank you for your support. I appreciate it. Based on the comments I'm getting from those new to the channel and/or from proponents, I've repeated some information about authorship, FC, and facilitator cueing in this video. I've put timestamps in the description box below this video if you'd like to skip around. Goals of this video: to review the two main categories of facilitated communication, to identify the types and characteristics of the forms of FC used by participants featured in the Telepathy Tapes podcast, to point out facilitator behaviors in a double-blind telepathy test that raise concerns about who is controlling the activity. Observations of a former facilitator. What follows are my observations as a former facilitator who, unlike 100% of the current-day facilitators, participated in reliably controlled authorship testing in 1993, just 3 years after FC was introduced to the U.S. by Douglas Bicklin of Syracuse University. Before I get to the critique, I'd like to take a moment to share some things I learned about FC after the testing. These are things workshop leaders failed to tell us in the training. FC was not then, and is not now, an evidence-based technique. Anecdotes and testimonials, aka feel-good miracle stories, are not evidence, though facilitators may sincerely believe in the technique. Reliably controlled tests consistently show that the FC-generated responses are only correct when the facilitators have access to the test stimuli. Question: if the communications are independent, why does the facilitator have to know the answers for it to quote-unquote work? When facilitators are blinded from test stimuli, the FC-generated responses are either incorrect, the clients can't spell, unintelligible, the clients don't have letter sound recognition, or correctly spelled with words that have nothing to do with the questions being asked. In other words, facilitator guesses. Most facilitators are unaware of the extent to which they use physical, visual, and/or auditory cues to influence and control letter selection. Well-intentioned people can be fooled by FC. I stopped using FC after the testing in 1993, but I have continued studying it over the past 30-plus years. I've also been waiting for proponents to conduct reliably controlled studies that address facilitator cueing and prove communication independence with these techniques. I am, and the world is, still waiting. Today's facilitators are taught not to participate in reliably controlled studies designed to separate facilitator behaviors from those of their clients or loved ones. Some facilitators claim it's unethical to test for authorship. But even without the reliably controlled testing, we can learn a great deal about facilitator behaviors through pro-FC movies, YouTube videos, and other media. The Telepathy Tapes. The Telepathy Tapes podcast is currently drawing a lot of attention in the United States for its claims that non-speaking individuals with autism have telepathic abilities. The presenter of the podcast, Kai Dickens, and the experts featured in the podcast, however, downplay the fact that the autistic individuals featured in the podcast are being subjected to a discredited technique known as facilitated communication. Proponents of FC have yet to provide reliably controlled evidence that the technique leads to communication independence for those individuals being subjected to its use. In fact, the evidence shows that facilitators are often inadvertently controlling letter selection. To date, facilitator authorship and FC-generated messages have only been ruled in, not ruled out, when tests have been conducted under reliably controlled conditions that blind facilitators from test stimuli. In the telepathy tapes, the participants, not the facilitators, were denied access to the pictures, words, and numbers being spelled out using FC. In each test, the facilitators knew the answers to the spelled responses. Promoters of the telepathy tapes seem confused about what constitutes facilitated communication, a technique that was discredited in the United States by 1995. Facilitator-dependent techniques. Facilitated communication, or FC, is an umbrella term that represents all facilitator-dependent techniques, regardless of whether the facilitator holds onto the client or holds onto the letterboard. Over the years, FC has evolved into two main categories, touch-based and no-touch forms of FC. Two main categories of facilitated communication. Touch-based FC. The facilitator supports the child by holding onto his wrist, forearm, elbow, shoulder, or other body part during letter selection. It's known as supported typing, saved by typing, assisted typing, hand over hand, letterboarding, and others. Minimal or no touch FC. The facilitator holds a letterboard or stencil in the air while the child extends a finger toward it. Sometimes, but rarely, the child holds onto the keyboard or letterboard, but the facilitator still uses visual or auditory cues to aid in letter selection. It's known as rapid prompting method, spelling to communicate, speller's method, informative pointing, spelling with eyes, and others. Role of facilitators or communication regulation partners. Facilitator role in touch-based FC. Proponent view. Provide physical and emotional support. Study the motor movements of the individual. Redirect the individual's attention if necessary. Fade support from wrist to shoulder. Presume competence. And don't test. Skeptic view. Facilitators often unwittingly cue their clients in ways that not only influence but control letter selection. Fading support from wrist to shoulder does not eliminate the facilitator influence over letter selection. Authorship can be tested by controlling the information the facilitator sees during testing. Facilitator role in no-touch forms of FC. Proponent view. Communication difficulties in autistic individuals are primarily due to motor difficulties and require their support. Cueing cannot occur if the facilitator doesn't touch their client. There is a mind-to-mind bond between facilitator and child. Skeptic view. Many autistic individuals perform gross and fine motor activities independently and without facilitator interference. So why can't they select letters on a keyboard by themselves? Facilitators, however, unwittingly, can cue their clients even when the board is being held in the air with minimal physical touch. FC conversations are one-sided and facilitator controlled. For more detailed information about FC in all its variant forms, please visit facilitatedcommunication.org or FC is Not Science, my YouTube channel. FC and telepathy. Promoters of the telepathy tapes want us to believe that non-speaking autistic individuals being subjected to FC, S2C, and RPM have telepathic abilities. This is quite an extraordinary claim. But does FC work? Does telepathy exist? Proponent view. FC works because people using FC say it works. Telepathy works because facilitators and parents feel like it works. People who question these beliefs are against people with disabilities. Skeptic view. All reliably controlled tests of authorship to date demonstrate that the facilitator, not the individual being subjected to FC, are controlling the messages. Telepathy testing in FC cannot be determined until authorship is established. Testing for facilitator cues. The key to proving FC authorship and telepathic abilities is to determine whether the spelled responses can be attributed to the autistic individual without external cues from the facilitators. This is most reliably done through carefully controlled message passing tests that are designed to separate facilitator behaviors from those of the individual being subjected to FC. Main categories of facilitator cueing: physical. Touches by the facilitator on the client's wrist, elbow, shoulder, or other body part. Even slight changes in pressure can influence letter selection. Visual. Movements from the facilitator, like head nods, hand signals, and shifts in body weight, can signal the client where on the letterboard to touch. Often these movements are inadvertent, but not always. Verbal or auditory. Spoken utterances that signal to the client where on the letterboard to touch, like when the facilitator says the sound of the target letter before the individual touches the board. It should be noted that facilitators may or may not be fully aware of the extent to which these cues influence and control letter selection. Facilitators are even taught in some workshops to prompt their hearts out. Purpose of cueing. Proponent view. To physically and emotionally support the client. To help regulate his or her movements. To help correct and/or prevent repetitive or self-stimming behaviors. Skeptic view. FC, S2C, and RPM doesn't work without facilitator cues. Individuals are essentially taught to point on cue through repetition and reinforcement of the desired behavior, pointing a finger toward the letterboard. NA cues by the facilitators should be faded within days, not weeks or years, after teaching a client a new skill. A telepathy test. In today's example from the telepathy tapes, the non-speaking autistic individual is sitting outside with the camera crew and others around her. Her mother, acting as facilitator, is beside her. The original video is 1 minute 34 seconds long. It also shows 4 different camera angles at once. I've pared down the video to 42 seconds to highlight the section when FC is used. The critiques that follow are taken from the same 42-second segment.
Y tú también, fíjate. A ver, cuéntale que qué color era el que estaba ahí. ¿Qué color era, mía, el que estaba ahí? ¿Lo viste? Sí, ¿qué color era? ¿Qué color era? Hola. ¿Qué color era? ¿Qué color era? Vamos. ¿Ah? Ma. R. I. L. L. O.
So she doesn't need her mother to see it. That's
The mother is using a hybrid form of FC where she both holds onto her daughter's forehead and holds a letterboard in the air. Double-blind test. When researchers refer to a double-blind test, they are usually referring to a specific test design in which both the researchers and the participants are kept from or blinded from the test stimuli or treatment intervention. In this case, both the young girl and the facilitator are blindfolded, while the researchers, assistants, and the camera crew watch as the researcher puts a yellow object under a clear bowl. The object is then removed and the facilitator and young girl, after taking their blindfolds off, are asked to spell out the color of the yellow object. In episode 1 of the podcast, but not in this video clip, we are told that the mother, the facilitator, does not speak much English, so it should come as no surprise that the facilitated response is in Spanish. Here's a clip of the FC session without annotation. The young girl seems more interested in waving to everyone than she does in spelling.
¿Lo viste? Sí, ¿qué color era? ¿Qué color era? Hola. ¿Qué color era? ¿Qué color era? Vamos. ¿Ah? Ma. R.
I, L, L, O.
So she doesn't need her mother to see.
Facilitator behaviors number 1. Facilitator eye contact with the letterboard. One hallmark of FC is that the facilitators maintain constant eye contact with the letterboard during letter selection, while the clients do not. Let's take a closer look at the facilitator's eye contact with the letterboard, then we'll look at the young girl's eye contact after that.
¿Estaba ahí? ¿Lo viste?
Sí, ¿qué color
¿Qué color era?
Hola.
¿Qué color era?
¿Qué color era? Vamos.
Ah,
Ma. R. I. L. L. O.
So she doesn't need her mother to see.
¿estaba ahí? ¿Lo viste?
Sí, ¿qué color
¿Qué color era?
Hola.
¿Qué color era?
¿Qué color era? Vamos.
Ah,
Ma. R. I. L. L. O.
So she doesn't need her mother to see.
Did she peek? I would have. While looking at the clips more closely, I noticed the facilitator adjusting her mask and looking in the direction of the yellow object. Did she peek? I would have. We've been told by the podcast host that they believe the child can, quote unquote, see everywhere, and that's why she can allegedly see the color of the object while wearing a blindfold and then type it out with her mother's help. What would have happened to the young girl's ability to telepathically receive and spell out the color of the object on the table if the facilitator had been out of visual range when the object was shown to the blindfolded girl? Facilitator behaviors number 2, moving the board in the air. Another hallmark of FC is that when a facilitator holds the letterboard in the air, the board drifts toward the target letter. Often facilitators are unaware of the extent to which they move the board to aid in letter selection. In this next clip, I've added yellow lines to draw your attention to the letterboard drift.
¿estaba ahí? ¿Lo viste?
Sí, ¿qué color
¿Qué color era?
Hola.
¿Qué color era?
¿Qué color era? Vamos.
Ah,
Ma. R. I. L. L. O.
So she doesn't need her mother to see.
Facilitator behaviors number 3, physical touch. The facilitator in this example appears to be using physical touch to direct her daughter toward the desired letters. She uses the palm of her hand and fingers to move her child's head, and, possibly, her fingertips to signal when to touch the letterboard. It's strange to me that the facilitator is holding the letterboard so far away from the young girl, but that makes it easier for the girl to move her arm like a pendulum. All she needs to do is hover her finger toward the letterboard while the facilitator brings the letterboard up to her outstretched finger. I've zoomed in on the girl's forehead to focus your attention on the mother's touch. You can also see the girl's eyes looking away from the letterboard in this clip as well.
¿estaba ahí? ¿Lo viste?
Sí, ¿qué color
¿Qué color era?
Hola.
¿Qué color era?
¿Qué color era? Vamos.
Ah,
Ma. R. I. L. L. O.
So she doesn't need her mother to see.
Facilitator behaviors, verbal cues. Facilitators, particularly in no-touch forms of FC, use verbal cueing to signal which letters they want their clients to touch. These cues are often given ahead of the client's touch on the letterboard. I'm not sure that's what's happening in this case, but let me know in the comments what you think. To me, it looks like the facilitator is calling out letters when her daughter's finger gets close to the target letter. Because the daughter doesn't appear to be moving deliberately to select letters, I have my doubts as to whether she understands what she's supposed to be doing, besides pointing a finger toward the letterboard. I'd be interested to know if the young girl can understand and use written language on any level independently and without interference from the facilitator. I've been asked whether I think the facilitators featured in the telepathy tapes are deliberately cheating. At this point, I have no reason to believe that these parents are anything but sincere in their belief regarding FC and possibly telepathy. However, because she's probably just following the FC guidelines she was taught during the training, the facilitator may not be aware of the extent to which physical, visual, and auditory cues can influence and control letter selection. Facilitators are taught not to test for competence, aka FC authorship, so it is likely that she has not participated in reliably controlled testing to rule in or rule out her own behaviors during the spelling activities. I think that's why I get so frustrated with the so-called experts featured in the telepathy tapes. They're the ones who should be guiding these parents to seek help from professionals trained in evidence-based communication techniques and legitimate augmentative and alternative communication, not stringing them along with the false promises of pseudoscience. FC was discredited over 30 years ago. And yet Diane Hennessy Powell, one of the experts featured in the telepathy tapes, seems completely taken in by this display. After the blind test, she says, so she doesn't need her mother to see it.
So she doesn't need her mother to see it.
Was this a reliably controlled test for telepathy? Proponent view. Yes, both the girl and the facilitator were blindfolded, but knew the color of the object was yellow. Skeptic view. No, it's possible, probable, that the mother saw the object when she was adjusting her mask. A reliably controlled test would have made sure that the facilitator was out of visual and auditory range before displaying the object. Was the spelled response independently produced? Proponent view. Yes, the girl reached for the letterboard without her mother touching her hand. Skeptic view. No, the facilitator was controlling the letterboard, holding it in the air, and holding onto her daughter's forehead. These behaviors raise questions about authorship. The FC-generated responses cannot be considered independent unless the external behaviors of the facilitator can be ruled out. Summary. The Telepathy Tapes is a popular podcast claiming that non-speaking individuals with autism have telepathic abilities. The producers of the podcast fail to inform their listeners that the individuals featured in the testing are being subjected to a discredited communication technique called facilitated communication. There are two main categories for FC, touch-based and minimal or no touch. Regardless of which form of FC the spellers in the podcast are being subjected to, there is no reliably controlled testing to prove proponent claims of independent communication among its users. Rather, facilitators, not those being subjected to FC, are likely the authors of FC-generated messages. Facilitators, though well-meaning, are often unaware of the extent to which they control letter selection through physical, visual, and auditory cueing. Anecdotes and testimonials, though interesting and often where scientific inquiry begins, are not evidence. In today's example of a telepathy test, the mother used a hybrid form of FC. By holding onto the letterboard and her daughter's forehead, the facilitator exhibited behaviors that raise questions about authorship. It's also possible that the mother inadvertently saw the color of the object while adjusting her mask, so the idea that this was a telepathic transmission was, in my opinion, not proven. For this to be a reliably controlled test for FC authorship or for telepathy, the facilitator would need to be reliably blinded from the test stimuli and all external cues eliminated. This telepathy test raises more questions than answers. Here are a few questions off the top of my head. Put your questions in the comments below this video if you can think of others regarding FC, telepathy, or this test. What would happen to the daughter's ability to spell the color of an object presented to her while she was blindfolded if the facilitator was out of visual and auditory range when the object was shown to the daughter? What would happen if the letterboard was placed on a stable surface and the facilitator was not allowed to see or touch the board during letter selection? Does the daughter have letter sound recognition? Does she understand and can she use the symbols of written language, for example, letters, to spell words? Has the daughter undergone a complete speech and language evaluation in Spanish and in English without the facilitator to determine her understanding and use of spoken and written language in both languages she's purported to know? The science. To date, there's no scientifically rigorous evidence to prove facilitated communication, spelling to communicate, rapid prompting method, or any of their variants produce independent communication. Controlled studies show that facilitators, not their clients, are producing the typed messages. Many organizations oppose the use of facilitator-reliant techniques. These include, but are not limited to, the American Speech-Language Hearing Association, American Association on Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities, American Psychological Association, Association for Behavior Analysis, Association for Science in Autism Treatment. These organizations cite the following reasons they encourage their members not to use facilitator-reliant techniques: lack of scientific evidence, prompt dependency, facilitator cueing and control over letter selection, potential harms, including false allegations of abuse, lost opportunity costs as individuals are prevented access to evidence-based forms of augmentative and alternative communication. This educational video is intended to draw attention to the problem of facilitator cueing and a technique called facilitated communication. Criticisms of FC, S2C, RPM, or any of their variants contained in this video are not directed at the individuals being subjected to its use. For more information about FC, please visit facilitatedcommunication.org. Please subscribe, like, share, and comment to help grow this project. Thank you for watching until the very end, and remember, FC is not science.